Hello, everyone. It is 1 o'clock. Thanks for joining this webinar about Resilient Connecticut. I'm Katie Lund from CIRCA, and I'll be moderating this hour webinar, which is going to focus on this new project that CIRCA is managing called Resilient Connecticut. Hopefully you can all see the slides with that title slide. This is the first webinar in what we plan to offer as a monthly series on a variety of resilience topics, along with partners in the state. Today, our presenters will include CIRCA staff. Jim O'Donnell is going to start with a welcome as our Executive Director. John Trzynski, the Director of Resilience Planning, and Alex Felsen, the Director of Resilience Design, are also going to be presenting concepts about the Resilient Connecticut Project. Before they start, though, a few housekeeping items that I want to mention. The webinar is being recorded and we'll post it online. So if you like what you hear and see, please tell people about it who can't join us today. You all have your audio muted, except for the presenters, but you can use the chat box, which you can access as the chat bubble on the bottom of your screen. And when you click that bubble, your chat box should open on the right. And so you should use that throughout the presentations if you have a question. And we'll try and save 15 minutes at the end of the call for a Q&A. And I'll do my best to track it throughout the webinar and facilitate the responses with the presenters here. So thank you for joining. I'm going to turn it over to Jim O'Donnell to begin.
Good morning. I want to say a few words about CIRCA first, and then I'll go on to discuss what we've been doing in the Resilient Connecticut Project. So CIRCA has been around now for about 5 years. It's a collaboration between the University of Connecticut and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And the office is at Avery Point campus of the university. We've got the mission of the organization is to increase the resilience and sustainability of the vulnerable communities in Connecticut's coastal and inland areas to severe storms and the impacts of climate change. And we're interested in the natural, built, and the human environment. And our goal is to try and help towns minimize their exposure to those risks. That's the principal motivation. And we've worked with many of the state agencies already and many of the towns in Connecticut. And today we're going to talk about Resilient Connecticut, a new project that we're undertaking with the support of the Connecticut Department of Housing and the Federal Department of Housing. Okay, so CIRCA has got several staff, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute, with a broad range of backgrounds and capacities. In addition to that, we have connections with and support of many departments and colleges of the university, including the School of Law, College of Engineering, Department of Economics and Agricultural Economics, Marine Sciences, Communications, Geography, Landscape Architecture, and some others. And so together that breadth of experience is being aligned to try and develop projects that can provide information to the towns and citizens of Connecticut in order to advance this mission of helping adaptation strategies. So in the screen you see here, just illustrations of the kinds of things that we've been doing. On the top left, there is a GIS source for model analysis results. In the middle, there is a concept diagram for how landscape architecture and planning can guide thinking about options for flood risk reduction. In the bottom right, there is a graphic I'm going to talk about a lot in a minute. So the CIRCA staff are people, and some images are here. I'm the top left, and that's quite an old picture. I'm a little older than that now. And then John Trzynski is going to speak next as Director of Resilience Planning, and Katie Lund has coordinated this call, and she's Director of Community Engagement. And Alex Felsen, who will speak later, is Deputy Director and Director of Resilience Design. And then others are equally important, but I really don't have time to go over all of their great skills. So what I want to tell you about first is why Connecticut's different from the rest of the world. You know, everybody knows it's pretty special. And for these purposes, special means its geography. You know, in particular, it's located in the Northwest Atlantic. And so, consequently, the area experiences two different types of storms, nor'easters and hurricanes. Hurricanes are infrequent, and their characteristically different than from nor'easters. Nor'easters get their name because the wind blows from northeast for quite some time, and that creates water level variations in the Sound. So in the western Sound, the water piles up relative to the eastern Sound. In addition, nor'easters raise the water level all along the south shore of southern New England. And so the water level everywhere along the shoreline of Long Island goes up. Then it goes up more in the west of Long Island Sound because of this local effect. So in addition, the length of Long Island Sound turns out to be what's called near resonant with the principal tidal frequency. And so although that's why sea level fluctuations during the day have about an amplitude of 30 to 40 centimeters in eastern Long Island Sound and maybe 2 meters at the western end of Long Island Sound. And so water level fluctuations in the western Sound due to both tides and storm surges are much larger than they are in the eastern Sound. And that's just a consequence of where we are in the North Atlantic. Second big thing about Connecticut that's important is that the topography of the state was created when Europe and the North American plates bumped into each other. And that created ridges that run north-south as a consequence of this collision. And then at subsequent, the opening of the Atlantic created rifts, and so the valley of the Connecticut River, for example, just dropped. And so that's why the Connecticut River is where it is. And about 10,000 years ago, the last glaciation carved out, there was many cycles of glaciation, but the last one ended about 10,000 years ago. And it carved out a lot of rock from New England and piled it along the red lines here shown on the top left figure here. And my mouse is pointing to it now. This is a moraine, and that dammed Long Island Sound for a long time. And so it became a freshwater lake, and sea level 10,000 years ago was lower, so the water spilled out of the eastern end and ran across the shelf, and leaving this lake to be filled with sediments from the receding glaciers. The water level at that point was a little above where the mean sea level is now, and so around the mouths of the major rivers that were coming from these draining glaciers, sediment was deposited in these green areas I'm pointing to in the lower left, Those are areas where sand and gravel deposits were left just below the lake level. And then when the lake drained, they were exposed, and they became where major towns developed in Connecticut. Now, I'm belaboring this because of one important point, and that is when sea level rises further, the 100-year flood zone, which is where the federal flood insurance program defines as places where insurance is necessary, it's going to expand. And I show on the right here in purple regions which are likely to be flooded by a storm that would be like a 1 in 100 event when sea level is 50 centimeters higher. And so this area is Milford, I think. And Fairfield. It's Fairfield. And the red area surrounding the purple is the area that would be flooded in addition if the sea level went to a meter above current mean water levels. Right? So a lot gets flooded after 50 centimeters, but not much more after a meter. Right? And that's because all these low areas that were created by the glaciers are where much of a lot of housing is, and they're vulnerable. But inland of that, and in the bottom left, it's everything that's not green, basically, is pretty inherently resilient. So I'm going to talk for a moment about what other things will change, and then I'll come back to the flooding point. So we sponsored CIRCA sponsored a group of climatologists at UConn recently to create a report on what we expect to see for temperature and precipitation changes in the next 100 years based on best available science. It's led by Angie Seth, and they're preparing a report that should be released in the next few weeks. And this graphic shows what we expect to see in Connecticut in particular for in red for the next 100 years. And the red stripe is the best estimate for the annual mean, and then the shading area is the range of variability that models predict. Black line shows data, so you can see since 1950 or so, 55 or so, it's been increasing, and that increase is expected to accelerate, so that in the next 100 years or so, we expect a 5 to 10 degree Fahrenheit increase, which is a little more than the global mean, but not much more. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it has a significance in that small changes to the mean lead to large changes in things like the number of heat waves, the duration of the growing season. So the number of heat waves will increase substantially. There'll be a lot fewer frost days, and so that the growing season in Connecticut will increase by likely 35 days by 2050. So the point being that small changes of 1 or 2 or 3 degrees can have big impacts on things that are important. Similarly, we expect precipitation to rise a little bit. The annual mean will increase, and most of that increase will be a consequence of increasing rainfall in winter and summer. Sorry, winter and spring. Also, the number of days in which we experience heavy rain will increase, and perhaps, and it's likely that the likelihood of drought in the summer will increase. And the report that Angie's group has prepared provides lots of details and additional information about this, and it should be available via our website, CIRCA.uconn.edu, in the next few weeks. So this graphic shows the analysis that I did a couple years ago now for what we expect sea level to do in Connecticut. And these lines in the graph show 4 different ways of estimating the upper bound of the likely range of mean sea level in the future. So the models differ. There are several different ways of estimating what's likely to happen. And I also analyzed data from New London, Bridgeport, New Haven, and Willets Point. And these lines show the results of 4 different ways of estimating this upper bound for planning purposes. What you see is by 2050, they're kind of close together. They agree that it's going to be about 50 centimeters or 20 inches in 2050, plus or minus, maybe 5 or 10 inches. After that, the range explodes. The differences are quite dramatic, and it could be as low as half a meter, or maybe as much as over 2 meters. And those differences are a consequence of 2 things. One is uncertainty about how well we understand how melting of glaciers is going to be affected by warming of the ocean. And we're not really sure for how rapidly CO2 emissions will change in the next 50 years. So what the conclusion of our analysis suggested that towns should plan for up to 50 inches by 2050, and that was enacted
20 inches.
50 centimeters by 2050, or 20 inches. And that was enacted in Senate Bill 18-82. In addition, the state is going to revise this every 10 years so that we can build into our planning the evolution of science and the developments in data analysis. Now, again, this doesn't seem like a lot, 20 inches or 50 centimeters, but small changes can lead to big impacts on flooding frequency. Now, this diagram on the right shows that all of the highest water levels occurred every year since record began in the 1930s. But on the right is what's called the return interval diagram, which is the same kind of data that's shown on the right, but ordered by decreasing elevation. So the point, this point on the right, which I'm pointing to, just above 2.2 meters, is the biggest value that's occurred in observations. And this one's the second biggest one, and the third biggest one, the fourth biggest one, etc. And see, there's lots of little ones down here, and there's a few over here on the right. These are the big hurricanes that have come and hit Connecticut. And down here, these storms in the middle range, those are the bad nor'easters that we've experienced. So when to try and estimate what the 100-year return interval is, or what's a 1% risk level in Connecticut, people look at data like this. NOAA does it, FEMA does it, the Corps of Engineers do it, and I've done it here. And then you draw a line through the points, and you get the black line shows that it's roughly 2 meters would be consistent with this data. But there's deviations because there's not a lot of data, and maybe it could be as high as 2.5 meters. The consequence of sea level rise would just be, one consequence would simply be increasing this curve. You know, if storm statistics stayed the same, we could get a line that looked more like this blue line, right, the upper blue line. That's just a 25 centimeter increase in the mean sea level, and then over the next 100 years, we might get data that fell along that line. So this vertical line here shows that the 10% risk, or the 10-year return interval, is roughly 1.4 meters now. And to get 1.4 meters in the future, though, you would be down here at about this is 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So you'd be in this interval, 2 to 3 years would be equivalent return interval for 1.4 meters with 25 centimeters. What that means is the flood risk would be increased by a factor of 5. So there's two things that sea level increase does. One is it raises the level of any storm, right, by whatever the mean increase has been. And that's what we call here on the left a flood height. So if you've got a seawall that defends you against the 100-year flood zone, the 100-year flood, then the 100-year flood is likely to be higher, and that flood wall might not be as much of a defense. Alternatively, if you're currently getting flooded, or your flood risk is 1 in 10, or you expect to be flooded once every 10 years, an increase in water level would lead to an increase in that frequency, and so you should expect to be flooded maybe once every 2 years instead of once every 10 years. So those are consequences that are fairly straightforward to predict, and there's not a lot of uncertainty in it because we have a lot of evidence of what the statistics of the return intervals are in the frequent range, and we don't have a lot of data from the infrequent ones. So now the question is what to do about that. So now I'm going to leave it to John Pruszynski, who is the Director of Resilience Planning in CIRCA, and he's going to summarize our project, Resilient Connecticut.
All right, thanks, Jim. So as Jim mentioned, I'm John Pruszynski, and I recently joined CIRCA about 6 months ago to work on this project. I'm going to give a little bit of a high-level overview of some of the details about the project, and after that I'll pass it to my colleague Alex Felsen to talk about some of the concepts that we'll be focusing on in the project. So Resilient Connecticut is one piece of a larger grant that came to the state of Connecticut from HUD through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And as part of that, the Connecticut Department of Housing is developing a series of pilot projects in Bridgeport. One piece of the grant also is focused on developing and piloting a regional resilience planning framework in Fairfield and New Haven counties. And so that is the piece that we are focused on through Resilient Connecticut. So Resilient Connecticut is a partnership between CIRCA and the University of Connecticut and something called the State Agencies Fostering Resilience, or SAFER Council. So the SAFER Council was established after several storms had impacted the state previously, Tropical Storm Irene and Superstorm Sandy. And it was really meant to bring together the state agencies and get them talking and collaborating and coordinating their efforts to respond to storms and the impacts of climate change. And so CIRCA is partnering with the SAFER Council to roll out this program called Resilient Connecticut. And the proposal that was awarded funding by HUD was really based around this concept of taking advantage and looking at the north-south ridge lines that we have in Connecticut that Jim mentioned, and using these north-south ridge lines or high ground where they're adjacent to patches of risk and what we call zones of shared risk, low-lying areas where there is vulnerable infrastructure, and sort of shifting development to these resilience corridors and using the frame of transit-oriented development to create an economic development strategy for communities in Connecticut. And Alex will talk a little bit more detail about that. So the goals of the Resilient Connecticut project are, as I mentioned, to establish resilient communities through smart planning, framed around resilient transit-oriented development, and incorporating the assessment of vulnerability and risk to critical infrastructure in Fairfield and New Haven counties. So really looking at the critical infrastructure risks and vulnerabilities that stretch beyond the political boundaries of a single municipality. So we're really trying to focus at a regional scale on the risks and the solutions to those risks. And we are also focused on looking at the watershed scale as a way to frame the issues of flooding and vulnerability, as well as the solutions. So another key piece of this will be to develop climate adaptation plans in these two counties and really leverage and focus the research and technical capacities and capabilities that CIRCA and UConn have, and really focus those on the issues that are important to communities in these two counties, and really push the science forward and push the threshold of planning forward for Connecticut as a whole. So the project is really, it's broken up into 3 phases. So the first phase is really to develop a regional resilience planning framework, and that is the current phase, which began in the fall of 2018 and will continue until this coming fall. The second phase is to conduct and develop plans in Fairfield and New Haven counties. And phase 3 is really looking at site scale planning and developing implementation plans for projects that emerge and are prioritized through phase 2 of the project. So just to talk through a little bit more detail on each of those phases. So phase 1, as I mentioned, began last fall, is going to continue until this coming fall. And it's really about bringing together the stakeholders, getting a conversation going about basically assessing where this planning is in Connecticut. So the state of climate adaptation planning in Connecticut, and really looking at the existing plans that have been previously done and building on that work, and really identifying where the additional needs for planning are and building on the previous work that's been done. And developing, as I mentioned, developing a resilience framework that would guide plans and projects in the later phases of the program. So phase 2 would begin this coming fall and would run for probably through the end of 2020. And so this will be where we're developing and conducting planning in the 2 counties. This will be a partnership. We anticipate this will be a partnership between CIRCA and UConn, contractors, regional councils of government, and local communities. And we'll be, as I mentioned, working at the regional and the municipal scale to develop an assessment of risk and looking at areas that are vulnerable beyond the boundaries of a single town. Phase 3 of the project would run from 2021 through the end of the project, which would be May of 2022. And this will be to really focus on site-scale planning, developing implementation plans, developing cost estimates for projects that are prioritized and come out of the phase 2 of the project, as well as kind of synthesizing all of the results of the project and handing off what we call a resilience roadmap to the state of Connecticut to move forward on climate adaptation planning. So, as I mentioned, one of the major features of the project is really developing the capacity to do new modeling, develop new data sets, and new technical analysis that would support planning in Fairfield and New Haven counties. And so CIRCA will be also focused on developing research. Some of that research will be focused on economics. Some of it will be focused on policy and legal considerations and management of projects. So we will be using that research to really focus on supporting that planning process. So this timeline is a schematic which you can take a look in a little more detail. This is up on our website. This will also be in the slides that you'll be able to access after the webinar. But it really identifies how we're thinking of these parallel processes where planning is happening over the 3 phases and the science and technical research that we'll be conducting to support that. The pink icons in the top line, these will be annual summits that we'll be having once a year. The first annual summit will be this coming November, and this will be an opportunity for people to get involved and give us feedback on the project and really continue the conversation. So with that, there'll be a chance for people to ask questions at the end of the webinar on specifics, but I'm going to pass it to Alex, and you can talk a little bit more about some of the concepts that we'll be working with.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate that. So I'm just going to talk and focus in on the planning efforts that we're working on with this grant and with the state of Connecticut. So you can see here the image that was part of the submission process with the HUD National Disaster Resilience Grant. The basic concept is what we're calling the resilient corridors, which are the orange lines that go through the transit hubs that are part of Metro North and that provide a investment strategy as well as an egress route, building on the geography, the geology that Jim talked about earlier, to connect down to critical facilities and low-lying neighborhoods and other kind of critical components of town functions. So basically, just to take a step back, one of our big goals with this grant is to really bridge between technical knowledge and expertise and planning. And we are positioned in a role with working with state agencies, with municipalities, with the COGS and regional planning and academia to facilitate a process of research and technical analysis and modeling, and feeding that in, working with engineering firms and other private firms, design firms and NGOs, et cetera. So really bringing together the expertise and knowledge as well as the practical management challenges on the ground to come up with more innovative strategies that are also practical, that can be applied within Connecticut and that can build on the physical conditions of the land and the social and economic components of municipalities. So really the concept that we put forward with the grant and that was awarded funding is this concept of taking what's traditionally seen as a transit-oriented development, where you identify a quarter mile or a half mile walking distance from a public transportation facility, rail or bus, that provides supportive land use practices that can be zoned for increased density as well as mixed-use development. And to take that idea of a transit-oriented development and to turn it into a corridor that overlaps with municipal scale evacuation and egress routes. It also provides an investment strategies for a variety of state agencies. So the idea is that this resilience corridor, which reframes the risk management as an investment opportunity, can serve as a boundary object or a negotiating strategy between municipalities and the state. So there's a certain amount of alignment around the notion of a resilience corridor strategy for the state of Connecticut, particularly because the historic geography of the state includes these north-south ridge lines that make their way down to the coast with patches of risk. So here's an example, just looking in more detail in Bridgeport at some of the resilience corridors in blue, to illustrate also how those resilience corridors can align with commercial development, which is shown on the right side in red. So the notion is, can we invest strategically in corridors that provide connections down to low-lying communities or critical facilities, but do it through an investment strategy that takes into account a wide range of factors that are important for the municipality to function. So, for example, and just to say, this resilience corridor, as you can see, not only connects down to the coast, but it connects up into the region. And so the idea is that the investment strategy can be explored at the watershed scale and can take into account these coastal spaces as areas where there's a confluence of, for example, watershed flooding and coastal flooding. So on the left, thinking about the infrastructure systems that we've built in Connecticut to deal with sewage and stormwater and sewage treatment. In certain cases, these systems are combined, which create local flooding issues and costly retrofits. So the notion with this grant is, how can we explore these constraints or these circumstances within Connecticut and strategically think across the watershed scale as well as the coastal conditions. In the middle, looking more at the spatial scale of transportation networks moving up a watershed and thinking about land use practices along them. And on the right, thinking about temporal scale issues, so near-term 2020 flood risk versus a long-term 2080 flood risk, and using near to long-term planning strategies to inform near and mid-term decision-making. And just getting into a little more detail, because this aspect of the grant is one that's critical for CIRCA and critical for the state and the region to think about how we can investigate and evaluate Connecticut regionally in effective ways to understand smart economic investment strategies to reduce risk and also empower and improve the quality of the regions across Connecticut, and how to work with multiple municipalities to address some of these concerns. And on the left, it's looking at, this is a map that were produced through student work actually around the HUD NDR grant, focusing on land use patterns in the uplands and the impact on dissolved oxygen, but also thinking about coastal habitats and the ecosystems on the edge and how those can be fostered through land use change. And then thinking about the Neuronton River sub-regional basin from a regional transportation perspective as well as a land use consideration. And then zooming in, we're this regional scale, watershed approach is something that we're investigating all the way down to the site scale conditions. So thinking about the Quinnipiac River, for example, as a complex set of towns and management practices and land uses and ownership, and then to zoom in and think about the context around a an important ecological feature, a marsh complex along the Quinnipiac that couples as a volume for dealing with flooding, as well as commercial development, big box development, so a shopping area for North Haven in the region. So this idea of understanding land use patterns and the overlapping conditions of ecological, economic, social, and infrastructural constraints are critical components that we're interested in incorporating into our regional planning effort and working with municipalities and the COGS as well as other state agencies, et cetera, to define innovative solutions. We're getting all the way down to the municipal scale and to the site scale with this grant. So there's two phases. There's regional scale planning, and then there's site scale planning. And the notion is through the regional scales, we're hoping to identify innovative projects that we can work on at the site scale that can inform other locations across Connecticut, that can build on the good work that's been done by engineering and design firms and NGOs and nonprofits in the region, and that can help position municipalities to make smart choices. Here's an example in West Haven where there was a buyout, the first example of a buyout program through a floodplain easement through the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, and this idea of a transitioning strategy where it's recognized that there is investment in infrastructure in this area that needs to be maintained over time, and there's a potential for a resilience corridor, as you can see in the diagrams, and how that might evolve over time through a give and take approach with an impounded marsh condition to facilitate or allow flooding while also recognizing property ownership and the need for transitions. So Jim talked a bit about the examples, the technical analysis and the field research components of CIRCA. It's critical to recognize the importance of raising the threshold of integrating technical and research methods into planning and practice in the state of Connecticut. Because of the nature of the coastal conditions with the historic geology and the glacial landscapes, the configurations that we've come up with through urbanization in terms of road heights and impounded marshes, et cetera, create circumstances along the coast that need more detailed analysis to understand flood risks and to get a handle on elevation needs and how to adapt these locations effectively. So CIRCA is really interested in facilitating and working with engineering firms and with municipalities, town engineers, et cetera, to define those needs more carefully, to develop tools that can be useful to the public and to municipal planners, engineers, and professionals, and to help move forward Connecticut's approach to adaptation and to effectively incorporating research and modeling strategies. Here's an example, just to wrap up, with one of these strategies that we've been moving forward on. This is really a link of technical strategy to municipal planning. So we, as working on the Guilford Resilience Plan, we defined areas in Guilford that had what we called zones of shared risk. These were areas that had with subpopulations within Guilford that shared similar risks. So, like you can see the SH, where Satcham's Head is located, and Longmarsh, which has been studied through field research by CIRCA to understand the flood risk in a low-lying road in that area that impacts, a whole neighborhood. The idea of recognizing subpopulations that have similar risks and looking for ways of negotiating and prioritizing projects to facilitate larger populations and to identify cost-effective solutions is a key step for this planning and linking of technical analysis to practice. And just to summarize the work that we're doing across scales, basically on the left you can see the larger region. Connecticut is a political boundary with large watersheds that have connections across multiple states. We're interested in understanding and thinking about Connecticut and Long Island Sound from an ecological, social, political, and economic perspective, and then getting into more detail within Connecticut, understanding the glacial history and the geologic history, and thinking about the patches of risk that exist along the coast, as well as the the transportation and infrastructure investments that are a huge value to the state and that can be used as an asset for adaptation solutions. And then linking those conditions through field research, modeling analysis, and map viewers and other kinds of policy-related investigation and analysis, so that there's a technical side and a link between technical and planning. And then applying that approach to municipalities, working within and across municipalities, and then building on that process to identify and develop site-scale implementation-based solutions that can inform the entire state. Okay, and so this is a summary, and I just want to pass it on now to Katie to talk more about this critical stage aspect of the project engagement.
Thanks, Alex. Before I go through these last couple of slides, I just want to remind everyone that if you do have questions, that you can use the chat box by accessing it in the bubble at the bottom of your screen, or you should see a box on the lower right. So just a reminder to do that. So throughout the project, we're going to be using a variety of different strategies to engage different audiences. This slide shows some of those categories where we're going to be establishing advisory groups. John mentioned that we've already been meeting with a state agency work group, establishing a resilience framework advisory committee, and consulting technical advisors as needed throughout the project. We're going to be hosting different events regularly, which will include some workshops, an annual summit, which John mentioned being planned in November. That's more of a public event. And some more targeted design trainings and engineering trainings throughout different stages of the project, which will be a little bit after the summit and into the second and third years. And then, as I mentioned at the start of this webinar, that we plan to have a monthly webinar series, which this is kicking off. We do have a new website that we have launched this week, and I'll show you aspects of that in the next couple slides. And that is going to be a place where we really focus people on, information that's going to become available, data, map viewers, reports. John mentioned the inventory of existing resilience plans that we now have. That's actually online too. And so we're going to be using our website quite a bit to engage with people throughout the project. And then finally, using our existing Resilience Roundup newsletter and our announcements and regular tweets that go out. You can see on the right, there's a place to sign up for emails in the Resilience Roundup if you don't currently get them. But I just want to highlight aspects of the website here, which across the top, you can see the different categories of focus. And to focus in on what those are going to be primarily are highlighting different planning tools, different technical tools, some of the field research that will be starting over the course of the next year, and this engagement focus that I'm talking about today, where you can, when you go into that engagement tab, see a place here for that email and Resilience Roundup sign up. The next webinar is going to be May 28th, which is a month from today, Tuesday, May 28th. And it's going to be coordinated, and we're going to do it in partnership with the Community Economic Development Council. Sadie Colcord is coordinating that. And so we're going to be speaking to different planning associations and RPAs on a webinar in a month from now. But basically this engagement page, and also at the top, the announcements tab will be a place for you to keep in touch about all of those kinds of events. So I'm going to wrap up with that slide, and I want to be sure and thank you all for attending today, but we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the website, and I'll look here at the first question and pose it to one of our speakers. I guess the first one is actually mine. The first question is schedule for public events available yet? And will it be open, will these events be open to consultants? We do not have a formal schedule for the next year. John posted a timeline, which is actually part of the homepage of that website. which shows the frequency of events throughout the project. We have an invited list for an event that's going to be held May 22nd, which is targeted to municipalities and state agency staff. Right now, it's May 22nd, but we're also going to be having a public event in the beginning of November next year, and that will be open to consultants to attend. And moving on to the next question here. On the timeline, it looks like a flood risk assessment was listed as a 2018 activity. Is it completed? Why don't we have Jim, you can maybe answer that question. It's not yet completed, is the short answer, but if you want to talk a little bit more in detail about what the time frame for that is.
The flood risk assessment for the entire state is largely completed in the sense that is practical. For any particular location in Connecticut, the flood risk is very sensitive to small-scale structures like culverts and tide gates and marsh sheds. And so to go beyond what is available in a statewide mapping tool is not really very useful, I don't think. So a big part of our effort in the next 2 years is to do more detailed analysis at the site scale that takes into account the complex geometry of the connections between Long Island Sound, the rivers, and then the land.
And just as a follow-up to that, Jim, the question also goes on to ask if the flood risk will focus on transportation corridors, roads, as well as buildings and other locations. Maybe critical facilities would be part of that.
Yeah, since the flood risk is so variable and controlled by these small-scale structures, the process that we're engaged in now is going to have municipalities identify regions that they would prioritize for further study. Our goal is to work in areas which are deemed important, and we should provide flood risk for everything in those areas, including roads and houses and critical infrastructure.
Alex, you want to add something?
Sure. I think the process of our process of developing this tool, the intention is partly to share this as a methodology so that as projects come up in the future, they can use a similar methodology to evaluate flood risk in other locations. And they can apply the technical strategies that we're using here as an approach.
And let me just add, in addition, doing the analysis at that really fine scale allows us to evaluate the effectiveness of alternative options for flood risk reduction. So in addition to establishing what the current risk is and how it's likely to change, absent any intervention, we'll also be able to assess what the effectiveness of interventions would be.
Okay, great. A couple of you have asked what the website URL is, and I've put up that slide so you can see that across the top, so that's a pretty quick answer. And John, you might be able to address this question. Any discussion with the Sustainable CT program about incorporating this kind of municipal planning in the program's resilience metrics? I know you met with staff there.
Yes. So short answer is yes. We have discussed with Sustainable CT how they so far have been addressing resilience planning with towns, and creating. They already have an action based around that, and so I think we anticipate that we will be partnering with them along the way to help support making that action that they have stronger, and we will be working with Sustainable CT. I anticipate.
Okay, next question. What do policies look like in Connecticut with respect to ecosystem services that might be a way to finance solutions for wetland protection and land conservation? Pretty specific question, but Alex, I know this is a little bit under your umbrella, so I'll pass it to you.
Well, one near-term example that we've been talking about is the potential benefit or the potential function of areas in Connecticut where there are encumbrances like elevated roads or tide gates and marshes behind those tide gates that provide a catchment volume. So they reduce the tide gates might reduce the amount of water getting into the wetland, and then the wetlands have a certain capacity to deal with flooding. That functional aspect of the combined built and ecological system can have a reduced flooding value for homeowners in the area, and we'd like to evaluate those kinds of opportunities and values across Connecticut or across the region that we're working in to help inform ecosystem service evaluations. I showed the slide of the land use practices, the upland land use practices and the impact on coastal ecosystems and coastal habitats, and we're very interested in exploring ways of evaluating ecosystem service benefits and ecological value. I think it's one of the challenges when you work in economic terms and you're dealing with property that has a distinct value versus wetland systems, et cetera, that tend to have lower values. But we are part of the grant is really pulling together economic expertise and applying that to decision making and prioritization.
Okay, we have no more questions coming in. Want to make sure that we do still have a few minutes left, making sure that other people don't have targeted questions about the presentation or the overall approach for the next 3 years. New question, how do you envision municipal plans or projects through this effort interfacing with existing plans? That relates, I think, a little bit to the need at the start of the project. One of the first steps in phase one is to even inventory what those existing plans are and to identify pieces that are potentially overlapping with this effort, John.
Okay, well, we've been exploring this question because there is a lot of work that's already been done, and I would say it's not just plans, but it's also experts and different groups that have been actively involved in resilience planning in the state. We are very interested in building on the expertise and working towards towards improving the opportunities for the state of Connecticut and for municipalities. Our approach currently is to interface closely with the COGs and to build on the relationships that the COGs have with municipalities and the existing structure of decision-making and selection. So to really highlight with the COGs regional planning efforts and to contribute to that scale of analysis. And we feel that as we build on what the COGs are working on and the process that they go through to select projects, vote on projects, and implement or develop projects with what are usually ad hoc subgroups within the larger COG municipality groups. That approach we see as a benefit, and as we move forward with regional scale projects, that will inform our site scale selection.
And just to follow up on that, we don't want to repeat the work that's already been done. So to the degree that municipalities have already sort of identified what their issues are, we are focused on trying to get this project to really speak to the additional needs that are out there, and also really move forward with a multi-jurisdictional approach and kind of drill down on that and focus on that. So the degree that municipal projects, the risks and the vulnerabilities that are represented by municipal scale projects, where those risks and vulnerabilities extend beyond the boundaries of a single town, I think is something we are focused on, as well as looking at how the benefits of a project that is identified through this program, where the benefits of a project extend beyond the political boundaries of a single town. I think that generally is the frame that we are thinking about moving forward.
Thanks, Sean. How can this watershed municipal planning framework research be made available to inland watershed communities and tributaries?
There's the question of, we do have some scope constraints in terms of what the grant was originally proposed to do. It was really focused on coastal flood risk and assessment. But we anticipate that by looking at these issues from a watershed scale, that will include a mixture of coastal and upland communities where there are risks and solutions that could be shared across the watershed, and where that strategy makes sense. One of the pieces of the project will be to look at riverine flooding and doing modeling around that and coupling that riverine flooding with a modeling of coastal flooding. So we do anticipate that there will be some tools and research that will be relevant to upland communities where they have flood risks. Jim, you want to add something there?
Yeah, I want to just make clear that this planning project is the beginning of something that's going to take a long time, and it's going to have to extend and be repeated in other parts of the state. So our goal is, one of the goals of the project, is to figure out how to be effective at doing this kind of work. So we're going to try and develop regional solutions for the southwestern part of the state, but through the approach that we develop and then evaluate, we'll be able to replicate that in other parts of the state later.
Yeah, I think that's why the state agency work group is so critical, as well as the partnerships with some of these regional organizations and COGS. So I think we have time for one more question. It's focused on examples of site scale work. Do you think some communities may be interested in first floor elevation mapping to assess flood risk for buildings? Is that an example of the site scale work, Alex, that you mentioned, going from regional to municipal to site scale?
I mean, I think I would say that our site scale work is intended to have an impact on multiple homeowners and ideally multiple, neighborhoods, and even regions or areas within municipalities. So it's unlikely that we're going to get down to individual building finished floor elevation assessments, but we may get into issues like base flood elevations and the added elevation requirements from a municipal scale and the impact on height restrictions, for example, which is something that is a constraint in coastal areas. So aspects that are policy related that have bigger implications for the state or for municipal management and the tax base are topics that we definitely would be interested in exploring.
That was a pretty quick answer, Alex. So we actually have time for one more. Any attention being given to how municipalities can carry out adaptation in ways that enhance rather than undermine climate change mitigation, for example, greenhouse gas emissions reduction? That kind of combines the adaptation and mitigation, I guess, question, which might be a answer that involves some of the state GC3 or mitigation approaches.
So our project is focused on adaptation. However, we are aware that the state and the rest of the world actually has to address the mitigation issue too. And so, although our plan involves consideration of transport-oriented development, and that by itself could be a vehicle that would be used to reduce CO2 emissions, at least at a regional level. So connectivity between people's dwellings and their places of work, right, is a key aspect. I mean, shortening commutes, increasing the efficiency, expanding public transportation, these are all elements of regional planning that could be integrated to a transport-oriented development strategy, and that would be a strategy to reduce flood risk.
And I think careful consideration of the floodplain with, very strategic approaches considering, flood wall and construction. So really being cautious about raising roads and building areas versus other methodologies, I think is going to have an impact on the greenhouse gas emissions.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. So just a reminder that this has been recorded. We will post this and the future webinars that we host on our website, which is on the screen right now. Again, that URL. And I just want to mention too that as part of the screen on the far right is a link to CIRCA, which is also our partner site here, which lists all the different projects and the research we currently have funded and that are going to be forming a foundation for a lot of this work. So that is just to mention that that's what that CIRCA link actually goes to, is kind of the partner site to this, where you can find out a lot more information on several of these topics. So thank you all for attending today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to be in touch with you and hear more from you in the future.